Hello everyone and welcome to this video where we'll be looking at economic integration. We'll be having an overview of what economic integration is in reality, looking at the theory of absolute advantage as well as the theory of comparative advantage, and really trying to understand why it's best to think of international businesses as entities that operate across national borders, take advantage of national specialisms, of why individual economies specialize in different areas, production of particular resources, specialization when it comes to production of particular goods and services, rather than thinking of an international business as, for example, a British company which sells things overseas, or an American company which sells things overseas. That's not the most accurate way of thinking about international businesses today. They are genuinely international. They do have various aspects of their supply chains and their value chain spread across different locations internationally, and this is enabled by economic integration in the world today. So if we start just by looking at the reality of economic integration, so it is absolutely a clear and growing trend internationally. When we talk about economic integration, what we're talking about in a basic sense is the removal of barriers between national economies. So these barriers can be direct trade barriers in the form of tariffs imposed on goods coming into the country. So tariffs are simply additional costs levied or additional fees and taxes levied upon importing certain goods. They can take the form of barriers or bans on exporting goods as well as importing goods. So simply not allowing steel, for example, or not allowing particular classes of goods to be imported or exported. And the natural state, or what we can understand to be the normal state of economies, is that a significant amount of barriers exist between national economies. So with greater economic integration comes a removal or a reduction in the barriers of trade barriers between different countries. Now, while there have been a lot of geopolitical events and high-profile events, such as the Donald Trump presidency, which came with lots of high-profile spats with various different international trade partners, high-profile spats and a trade war of sorts between the US and China in particular, it's important to recognize that while these are particular events and blips, the overall trend over the last 30 or 40 years is quite clearly towards greater and greater economic integration. It's quite demonstrably stimulated trade and increased economic activity. So it is a very clear trend. There are a lot of differing impacts on the economies involved. So you do have lots of interesting specific effects on particular countries' wages, on employment, on specialization, on the state of diversification of various national economies, but the overall trend is quite clearly towards greater and greater integration. So if we want to understand why this is, there's quite a few things that we want to look at, but the first would be economies of scale. So this is a very well-established principle that the greater your production of a particular good or service, then the per unit cost of that good or service is reduced. So if you're producing, let's say, headphones, if you produce 1,000 headphones, you may have a per unit cost of say £20. But if you produce 10,000 or 100,000 headphones, that per unit cost is going to be reduced. It may end up being £15 or £14 or £10. So that's a fairly well-established and demonstrable principle when it comes to production of goods and services. Now, this is one of the underlying principles, underlying dynamics, which really drives economic integration because for two reasons. Firstly, in terms of the demand side, if you're producing, to stick to our example, headphones for sale in the UK, you have a particular addressable market. But if you're able to produce the same SKU or the same particular loadout or same model, and it can be sold in 30 different countries, then you're looking at a much larger potentially addressable market as you're able to increase production, and that in itself will reduce your per unit cost. As well as this, you have supply side factors as well. So if you're able to globalize your production, so you're able to not just have your production focused in on a particular country, but you're able to use raw materials, produce components in various different parts of the world to take advantage of the specialization of different economies for different types of economic activity, then you're able to take advantage of localized economies of scale as well, which will ultimately lead to a lower per unit cost. So this is one of the underlying reasons why international businesses have significant advantages over purely national companies. International businesses are able to target much larger markets, aggregate markets. They're able to produce goods to be sold in across multiple different countries, and therefore they can really take advantage of economies of scale in order to not just the other advantages such as global branding and so on, but also take advantage of just the reduction in their production costs. This often leads to the reality that national companies simply cannot compete. A really good example of this would simply be smartphones. The only market today really where you have smartphones which are produced only for a single national market is really China, and that's because China is the world's largest consumer market. Population is very high, a rapidly increasing middle class, lots of disposable income, and therefore it actually makes sense for phones to be produced, designed and produced and sold only in China. India is catching up to this to a degree. We are starting to see specialized phones being produced, marketed and sold only in the Indian market as well. But you don't see phones which are produced only for the UK market or only for the Russian market or only for the Brazilian market. And that's because the cost of designing and producing a modern smartphone is generally so high that it simply doesn't make sense to restrict your target market to just one country. And you simply wouldn't be able to compete against other competitors by doing so. So if you look at the companies which have come into existence, which are new smartphone manufacturers, they tend to be born global firms in order to take advantage of these economies of scale. So OnePlus, which is one of the most recent high-profile additions to the smartphone manufacturers group, they launched in I think over about 15 or 16 markets when they launched their first smartphone product, the OnePlus One phone. There simply isn't really space outside of definitely the Chinese market and perhaps the Indian market for a national smartphone. The cost of that national smartphone would be much higher than the global competitors, because you wouldn't be able to take advantage of the economies of scale, and therefore those products simply wouldn't be viable. So economies of scale helps us to understand why addressing larger and larger markets and the removal of trade barriers or the reduction of trade barriers is beneficial for particular international businesses, but this alone would only explain why international businesses have a specific competitive advantage over their national competitors through lower production costs. It doesn't tell us why economic integration also tends to result in an increase in output, in total output, and an increase in productivity, as well as an increase in economic activity. So for that, we need to look at two related concepts: the theory of absolute advantage as well as the theory of relative advantage, or comparative advantage, sorry. So if we take the first one, the theory of absolute advantage, this demonstrates why economic integration between different national economies results in a higher or a greater increase in overall output, where one country has specific specializations or is more efficient at producing something than another country. So if we take two countries here, let's for example country A and country B, and we look at spoons and forks. So country A is more efficient at producing spoons and country B is more efficient at producing forks. Will then gradually, as we see greater and greater international trade between the two countries, will lead to a situation where country A will only produce spoons and country B will only produce forks. And because each country is specialized at this, they have the ability to produce either spoons or forks more efficiently. You'd have a rise in productivity, a rise in efficiency, and lower overall prices. So the cost of producing spoons in country A is lower, so spoons will eventually cost less. And the cost of producing forks in country B is lower, so forks will eventually cost less as well. So in this situation, you'll have a general reduction in costs. The actual cost to consumers will be lower, you'd imagine, because the cost of production is lower, and you'd have a more efficient system of production and sale. So that makes sense where particular countries have particular specializations or particular advantages, and we can see examples of this around the world. So China has an absolute advantage when it comes to the manufacturing of particular goods, those that particularly need semi-skilled labor, for example, like electronics manufacturing. India has an absolute advantage when it comes to call centers, for example, that require native English speakers, technical education, and internet connectivity. So that makes sense to a large degree, but that still leaves us with the question of what happens when there is no absolute advantage. So one country actually does ultimately have an advantage when it comes to the production of all of the group of goods and services that we're looking at. So this leads us to the theory of comparative advantage rather than absolute advantage. So here in this example, let's say country A can produce both goods at a lower cost than country B. So we can use the example of cars and bicycles. So cars and bicycles are produced cheaper in country A. So it raises the question of, well, why would country A then engage in large-scale international trade and economic integration with country B if they are more efficient at producing both cars and bicycles? Well, this leads to the fact, or this leads to an understanding that even though there may not be an absolute advantage of country B, there is still a comparative advantage based upon the opportunity costs and therefore the overall output when it comes to production. So we're going to walk through an example which will hopefully make this fairly clear. We'll see the opportunity cost here represented in labor hours. So country A takes 10 labor hours to produce one car and 5 labor hours to produce one bike. Country B, on the other hand, takes 8 labor hours to produce a car and 2 labor hours to produce a bike. So country B actually does have an advantage in being able to produce both cars and bikes more efficiently. So that leads to an opportunity cost here. So to produce one car, country A could have produced 2 bikes. So an opportunity cost, just to remind you, is the cost of when you're doing, say, a particular activity, what you otherwise could have done with that time or money or resources. So opportunity cost even here, listening to this recorded lecture, let's say this video ends up being about half an hour long. You could have spent that time watching an episode of Modern Family or an episode of Community. So that's your opportunity cost, is what you could have done with your time or resources. And if country A was to produce a bike, that opportunity cost there, they could have produced 0.5, so half a car. And we have the same opportunity costs for country B. So could have produced 4 bikes in the time it took them to produce a car, or they could have produced a quarter of a car in the time it took for them to produce a bike. So that means that if we look at total output without specialization, given a arbitrary number of labor hours available, and we can say country A is able to produce 100 cars and 200 bikes to try and maximize their overall output. Country B is able to produce 125 cars and 500 bikes. So this leads to the overall total combined output of 225 cars and 700 bikes. So you may think, well, this is without specialization and this is fairly high totals. Is there any real advantage in specializing? And there is still an advantage of specializing here. So the optimal thing to do based upon the opportunity cost would be country A. If they're producing 200 cars, so focusing on cars, country B producing 25 cars and 900 bikes, and you'll see that this actually leads to a higher overall total output. So we still have 225 cars being produced, but now 900 rather than 700 bikes. The reason why this is the case is even though country B is more efficient at producing both cars and bikes, there are specific national conditions that lead to different opportunity costs in both countries, so we can still increase our overall total output even though country A is objectively less efficient at producing both cars and bikes. So this is an extremely simplified example using just 2 countries and using just one kind of resource. So we're only looking at the opportunity cost in terms of labor hours. But even if we throw in all of the complexity of the real world, so, huge range of products and services, huge range of required resources from capital to manufacturing knowledge to raw materials to different types of labor, the principle of comparative advantage still holds in that even if one country has overall a complete advantage when it comes to efficiency of production or the cost of production, through economic integration, through specialization in particular production of particular goods and services, you're still going to have an increase in the overall total output if you have integrated economies, and this would happen naturally through market forces. So country A, companies based in country A would naturally seek to produce the goods and services that are going to give them the greatest return, and are going to seek to find areas where they have some form of competitive advantage. Same thing for companies operating country B. So this wouldn't be top down and planned, but through market forces, you'd see an increase, or you'd expect to see an increase in the total overall output. So if we combine this with our understanding of economies of scale, if you have increased output, you will eventually see a reduction in per unit costs, and that will eventually, in theory, lead to a reduction in consumer costs and therefore stimulate consumer demand again. This is broadly very true in reality as well. This is why, even if you look in the European Union, the EU, prior to the expansion to the east, even when you had broadly similar economies like the UK, France and Germany, for example, you still see the benefits of economic integration, even though those economies are not ones which are heavily specialized and have big differences. So you still have a rise in overall output, you still have positive benefits to the individual national economies. So if we combine those 3 concepts, economies of scale, the theory of absolute advantage and the theory of comparative advantage, we get a pretty good understanding of what the major benefits of economic integration are. However, there's still a few other things that we want to look at in order to understand how or what conditions are really required to achieve these benefits. So it's not just about the reduction of trade barriers. We also really, in order to make maximum efficient use of specialization, we want to see free movement of two major ingredients, labor and capital. So if we go back to our example there about country A and country B, and trying to maximize our output when it comes to both cars and bikes, well, it can't be done in a vacuum. So what you would need really is for when country A starts specializing in car production and when country B starts specializing mostly in bike production, you would want to have specialized labor being able to move to where it's most needed. So this is where free movement of labor really does become important in order to allow for the specialization of particular national economies and regional economies. You need to have the ability of labor to move within that economically integrated area in order to address labor needs. As well as this, you'd also want the ability of capital to move to where is needed as well. So if specializing the production capabilities of country A towards cars requires significant capital investment, that investment may be present in country B, and you'd need the ability for that capital to move to country A and to be invested in country A with minimal barriers and minimal taxation and so on as well. So for optimal economic integration, you need to really have the ability for both capital and labor to move between borders in order to allow economies to specialize and in order to gain the best, most optimal outcomes. And just lastly, we're going to take a look at some of the major risks of economic integration. So what we've done so far is given really an overview of what economic integration is, taken a look at what some of the major benefits of economic integration are, as well as some of the requirements. However, it's important to state that just because these are clear benefits, global production does definitely increase the greater integration is present between national economies. That specialization of particular economies and particular areas absolutely does lead to cheaper production costs and greater economic activity and stimulation of economic activity. It would be a mistake to think that these are just unambiguously positive developments. There are clear risks and a clear range of different impacts. So some of these are different impacts on particular societies, impacts on political systems, and they are very, very clearly quite complex and very localized. So the impacts of economic integration, if we're looking at social impacts, they're very clearly based upon the particular specifics of the situations in various parts of the world. So if you want to understand the social impacts of economic integration in, say, Bangladesh, is going to be very different to the social impacts of economic integration in, say, Pakistan or China or Japan. The other major risk which occurs is that even though we have increasing economic integration, there are still risks to particular economic collapses or economic crises in one state. So with greater and more integrated economies comes more exposure to risk. So we have the example there of the Greek crisis, financial crisis within the EU over the last 10 years or so, and how that's had potential massive knock-on effects. So the greater the level of trade with a particular country, the greater the potential drawbacks if there was to be a change in that relationship. Another really good example would be the whole set of industries that have grown up with trade between the UK and the rest of the EU. And once the UK decided to leave the EU due to the Brexit vote, then obviously that comes with a whole host of negative economic, political, and social impacts as well.